The small town of Ligonier hosts one of the largest annual festivals amongst Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands. Over 3 days in October, Fort Ligonier Days may attract upwards to 100,000 visitors who rejoice in food and craft vendors running the length of the town's main streets. But the root of the festival can sometimes get obscured by all the merriments. On October 12, 1758, the land on which people stroll merrily across was a battlefield. French and native forces raided the British post at Loyal Handing as part of the French and Indian War. The ensuing action would be one of the last battles between Britain and France for control over the forks of the Ohio River. Yet this battle has often been misunderstood, stuck somewhere between obscurity and exaggeration. On this episode of Retracing History, we look to change that as we will discover the true significance that this battle of Fort Ligonier had upon colonial America. Previously in Retracing History, we explored one of the more famous campaigns from the French and Indian War, the Braddock Expedition. Notorious for ending in disaster, the destruction of Braddock's British army just a few miles southeast of Fort Duquesne set up a grim situation for the British American colonies, especially the colonies of Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia. For 3 years, the French waged what they called La Petite Guerre, the Little War. Essentially, it consisted of French-endorsed raids by parties largely consisting of native warriors, who did not need much motivation to defend their homelands from invasion. Some tribes were direct allies to King Louis XV, while others had their own reasons for going to war against Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, not to mention long-standing disputes between the tribes aligned with the rival European empires. The targets were often civilian homesteads and militia outposts, with the intention of demoralizing the British out of the conflict. With a tiny colonial population compared to the Brits, La Petite Guerre was essential to France's hopes of protecting their claims in North America. But as the war dragged on and new theaters of fighting opened up across the planet, the French forces guarding the Ohio River Valley were being put into an increasingly fragile situation. Since 1755, the British Empire had been attempting to win control over North America with a multi-pronged strategy. But by the end of 1757, most of those campaigns had either failed, stalled, or had been outright aborted. For 1758, they were sticking to that plan, but as spring dawned in the colonies, major shakeups in the British government were occurring. The regime, which had come to be known as the Newcastle Pitt Ministry, bolstered military spending and improved alliances to remove France from threatening British territories across the globe. This included authorizing a renewed campaign to finally capture Fort Duquesne and gain possession over the Ohio River Valley for King George II. The ensuing campaign came to be known as the Forbes Expedition. So to understand how we get to Fort Ligonier in the autumn of 1758, we must first understand the Forbes Expedition. And well, to understand the Forbes Expedition, you gotta understand the man in the name of it. That's John Forbes right here. He's a brigadier general in the British Army, has about 30 years military experience. He had actually served on the staff of a gentleman by the name of John Ligonier, who was an important officer in the British military. Fun little tidbit, Ligonier, he's a French Huguenot who fled to Britain to escape religious persecution. So yes, Fort Ligonier is a British fort with a French name. And that relationship of Ligonier, who Ligonier became chief of the Board of Ordnance during the French and Indian War, and later got bestowed the title of Field Marshal when the British were fearful the French may make a mainland invasion of the British Isles during this conflict. Anyways, this relationship between Ligonier and Forbes probably led Forbes to get the job of doing what General Braddock could not do. Now, where we begin to differentiate from the Braddock campaign is that, well, we are not starting in Virginia. We are starting in the colony of Pennsylvania. We're starting in Philadelphia, which is the largest city in the British colonies at the time. It's a massive port, so it's able to facilitate a larger army. Forbes is hoping to organize a force of about 5,000 soldiers. And let's harken back to the Braddock campaign. What did I say was the 3 key ingredients to a British officer taking possession of the Ohio River Valley? You need cooperation between the Crown, the colonies, and the indigenous tribes. Braddock made great headways, but ultimately was not successful in getting all three pieces together, hence his defeat. And while Forbes is going to have many of the same frustrations as Braddock, but for the moment, he sets up shop in Philadelphia in early 1758 and organizes an army of about 5,000 soldiers. And it is a combined force of crown soldiers, colonial soldiers, and native warriors. Forbes' army is much larger than Braddock, too. He ends up getting at least 5,000 soldiers, if not a little more, organized to begin the push onto Fort Duquesne. And he has actually followed in the footsteps of an auxiliary road that Braddock had ordered built to help support his campaign. You may have heard me talk a bit about that auxiliary road in the Braddock trilogy. It was known sometimes as Byrd's Road, named after James Byrd, who is a Pennsylvania provincial colonel who's about to become very important to Fort Ligonier's story. In any case, Carlisle will be where Forbes' army rendezvous and get some training, some brief training before they go out into the wilderness. And Carlisle is still actually very important for army education. And then they're moving west toward the Allegheny Mountains, following traces of Byrd's old road. They're going to pass through two Pennsylvania militia forts. After Braddock's defeat, the Pennsylvania frontier was wide open to raids by the French and their native allies. Pennsylvania, being a Quaker colony, being founded by pacifists, was not too used to having to organize armed forces. So this is the first major conflict you're going to see the Pennsylvania militia deployed in. They try to throw these ring of forts up to defend themselves. They're not very well engineered, but they do their job, and Forbes will incorporate them as supply depots as he continues to cut his way deeper into the wilderness. And then he's going to get to Fort Bedford. He'll establish this around the summer of 1758. And at Fort Bedford, he has a decision to make. Forbes is starting to lose. He's going a little bit behind schedule. Just like Braddock 3 years earlier, he is one of several British armies moving throughout North America at the time, and he's trying to keep in sync with them. And he has to make a decision. He could either go south to Fort Cumberland, Maryland, where reinforcements from the Virginia Regiment commanded by Colonel George Washington, as well as Marylanders, are awaiting to come up and support him. Forbes can go down, meet them at Fort Cumberland, and use the Braddock Road to advance, make the last push on to Fort Duquesne. Why would he want to use the Braddock Road? Well, it's already built. I mean, you'd have to do some maintenance, but it's already established, which in theory would make for a quicker march on Fort Duquesne. But there is the problem of that's probably the direction the French are also suspecting the British to attack. Or Forbes can go into the unknown. He could push over the Allegheny Mountains directly, over the actual Allegheny Mountain and what's called Laurel Ridge. And his quartermaster is advising that there is a great location for a forward outpost. It would have plenty of tall grass for the livestock and horses to graze upon. There's nice defensive positions for a small supply depot. It'd be a good launching point for the assault on Fort Duquesne. And worth noting, that quartermaster is John Sinclair. Same quartermaster as the Braddock campaign. So you're noticing all these ingredients in Forbes' campaign are really just recycled from the Braddock campaign. Was that a wise decision? Was that not? We're going to see that play out here shortly. So Fort Cumberland, road's already finished, but the enemy may be expecting that. We go to where John Sinclair's advising, but that requires more road construction, and we're going off of Sinclair's advice. After much debate, Forbes commits to building a new road over the Allegheny Mountains and building a forward outpost somewhere near the Loyal Hannah Creek. Forbes' hopes for success were resting on the advice of John Sinclair, who was a veteran of campaigning in the Ohio River Valley. But when officers of the British Army start arriving west of Laurel Ridge to this location near the Loyal Hannah Creek, they don't like what they see, what Sinclair is suggesting. Now, it's a little vague when you read through the primary sources, and when I say primary sources, I'm referring to the Bouquet papers.
Very fortunately, many of the letters that went in and out of the office of Colonel Henry Bouquet of the Royal American Regiment do survive and have now been preserved, have been republished in a multi-volume series, which, if you've ever watched my live streams, you'll see a string of blue books behind me over my shoulder. Yeah, that's volumes 2 through 6. So from going from that, I can't really locate where Sinclair was wanting this supply depot built. Wherever it was, the officers of the British Army did not like it at all. They saw it was too low. They saw the ground was too poor. They did not want to encamp an army there. And this really threw a wrench into Forbes' plans. What is he going to do now? He's moving the army west over Laurel Ridge and the Allegheny Mountain. He can't go back and then down to Fort Cumberland. That's going to take too much time. Now, there are a couple different officers that are going to arrive out here in late August of 1758. The first one I want to mention is Colonel Henry Bouquet. Bouquet is in charge of the Royal Americans that are detached to Forbes' army during his campaign. He really is the second in command of the entire British Army out here in the Ohio River Valley back in 1758. General Forbes is not well in health. He is not able to ride out on a horse and go command all the soldiers. So a lot of your forward operations are entrusted to Bouquet. You're also going to have Colonel James Burd, who we mentioned earlier. It's a Pennsylvania provincial colonel. It seems he had a background in engineering when he emigrated from Scotland. And if he did not have that background, boy, did he build one from learning on the fly during the French and Indian War. You'll see Byrd's name pop up in a lot of engineering operations during the war. First, Byrd's Road, that auxiliary road Braddock wanted to have established out of Philadelphia, which becomes incorporated as Forbes Road 3 years later. You're also going to have him engineering several of the PA militia forts across the Allegheny Mountains. And now he is here commanding a battalion of Pennsylvania provincials. He's out here. You're also going to have a guy by the name of Charles Rohr. He's also from the Royal American Regiment, but he's kind of acting as the unofficial chief of engineers for Forbes' army. And these three guys come together. They do not like Sinclair's choice of a ground for a fort. They tell Forbes that, but they have discovered what they feel is a better location 9 miles west over Chestnut Ridge, over the shoulder behind me. And I'm kind of pointing in the rough direction where Fort Duquesne was 50 miles to our west. And of course, today, 50 miles to our west is Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So this is what Bouquet is informing Forbes, who's back at camp at Bedford, that, hey, Sinclair's idea, very bad, not good for a defense. We found a better location, but we have to cross another ridge and build another fort. So throughout late August and early September, you have about 1,000, maybe even up to 1,500 men camped in this what is now the Ligonier Valley, and they don't know what to do. They're building as best they can a retrenched camp for the time being. They think they may be moving west over Chestnut Ridge for a better location. What are they going to do? Time is running out because winter is fast approaching. Yeah, it's only early September, but this is September 1758. Winter's very harsh in Pennsylvania in the 18th century. They start showing their face as early as October. So Forbes wants to take Fort Duquesne. He got to make a decision where this supply depot is going to be built so he can have a base camp for his assault on Fort Duquesne before winter sets in.
Without the approval of General Forbes, Colonel Bouquet took matters into his own hands. He authorized a reconnaissance party to scout Fort Duquesne and the land before it. While both Crown and colonial forces were moving more frequently in smaller detachments, this reconnaissance came to number approximately 800 men-at-arms. More than half of the vanguard Forbes had sent west to establish the post at Loyal Hanning. Bouquet later claimed the idea of such a large reconnaissance was Major James Grant's, who had grown particularly frustrated with the poor intelligence gathering by small scouting groups, made up of both colonists and natives. Unfortunately for everyone involved, the unsanctioned operation was a disaster. On September 14th, Grant attempted to advance upon Fort Duquesne directly, trying to intimidate the enemy inside with a display of redcoat pageantry. Quickly, native forces aligned with the French outflanked the British on both ends of their battle line, and trapping them upon a wooded hill now bisected by Grant Street in present-day Pittsburgh. A third of the British forces engaged that day would become casualties in what is now known as Grant's defeat, the Major himself being captured and Charles Rohr amongst the dead. With the vanguard of the British Army now in shatters, Bouquet had no choice but to commit to the post of Loyal Handing as Forbes' forward supply depot for the foreseeable future.
If you come and visit Fort Ligonier today in the 21st century, this is what you're going to see, at least from its eastern walls. And this is a reconstruction of what the fort may have looked like in the 1750s. Now, when archaeologists came out here back in the day and consulted with various historians, this is what they felt the outer retrenchment may have looked like. But upon talking with some of the staff here at Fort Ligonier, there is a reevaluation of the outer retrenchment. Think of the word, retrenchment, trench, digging, earth. And if you read through the Bouquet papers and you listen to, listen, okay, he's not whispering in my ear. If you read the words of men like Charles Rohr and James Burd and Henry Bouquet, you're going to discover they're talking a lot about digging and throwing up earthworks and words like that, not about cutting down logs to put in a logged outer wall. So throughout the summer this year, or I think they've been doing it for a few years now, Fort Ligonier Association have been working on building what a retrenched wall may have actually looked like here. And honestly, the engineering skills used here in the 1750s to build I guess you want to call a retrenched wall, a wall made of fascine sticks, kind of used as a retaining wall, and then a mound of dirt. And then when you dig the dirt up, dirt's a great bullet stopper, probably second only to water. And you also get a bit of a ditch, which means if the enemy is assaulting a wall like this, they have to go down into the ditch, and now they're now beneath the muzzles of these muskets a British soldier would have been behind. So imagine a wall like this earthen wall, an earthwork. And now just imagine it in the place of that logged wall wrapping around parts of the inner fort. That's probably what Fort Ligonier looked like in September of 1758 going into October. All right, so I'm inside the multimedia room for the museum. The reason I'm here, you'll notice on the wall, they have blow-ups of 6 known maps of Fort Ligonier's existence. And when you talk about Fort Ligonier, the battle on October 12th, and how this was reconstructed to be a museum, these maps are imperative. They may be the most important primary source documents. They show us the footprint of the fort. The problem is, if you look at these maps, you'll notice that the footprints kind of change. And I want to talk about 2 maps in particular. This first map was drawn by James Burd. Yes, Colonel James Burd of the Pennsylvanians, who was kind of in charge of the detachment sent out here in September until October. He's in charge of the fort during the attack on October 12th. And while his maps are pretty bare bones, I always make the joke, this is the most accurate map because it's very vague. It makes it very easy to answer because it's so vague. You'll kind of see up top, there's like a bit of like a old fort, almost like it's a little bit confusing, like a marked out area. Maybe that was where Sinclair proposed to build the fort, and then everybody else went, nope, we like this hilltop instead. And then you'll see these zigzag lines on top of high ground overlooking the Loyal Handing Creek and a spring. This is the earliest map of Fort Ligonier. There's not much to look at. You'll just see a bunch of zigzags. That would likely be the outer retrenchment that they talk about. Again, it's more likely not a logged wall, but initially it was more of a earthwork because it was thrown up in the matter of less than a week in September of 1758. And that's something really interesting. If you look off to the east of the fort, I know it's upside down, but essentially that says line of French attack. So that's indicating that the fighting, at least some of the fighting on October 12th, happened on the east side of the fort.
Now, having an army divided in the wilderness is undoubtedly going to make for a tempting target. In this case, the British detachment inside the unfinished Fort Ligonier came under the crosshairs of French and native forces out of Fort Duquesne. During the Forbes expedition, Fort Duquesne was under the command of Captain François-Marie Le Marchand de Lignery. Lignery was a seasoned veteran of military operations in North America, participating in numerous tribal wars and colonial border clashes stretching back 30 years previously. He had been at Braddock's defeat, and since then had been acting as the commander over Fort Duquesne. Now, it's not certain as to how many men Ligonier had command over at this time. It was very common for these garrisons to change strength quite frequently. It's safe to say that in the summer of 1758, he had about 1,000 men at arms. They had been pulled from the Compagnies Françaises de la Marine, essentially New France's main defense force, the Militia, New France's militia, and native tribes aligned with France. And these tribes would have consisted of Ohio River tribes like the Lenape and Shawnee, as well as other groups coming quite great distances like the Wyandot and Ottawa. As the weather turned cold, militia and tribal support waned for the need to tend to harvest. This was typical, but Ligonier was made uneasy by British representatives talking to the tribes of the Ohio country. Then came word that the key French supply depot, Fort Frontenac, had just been destroyed by the British. While it did not mean Fort Duquesne was without any winter food, it did mean there would be a strain upon supplies to the Ohio country. Ligonier needed to ensure the British would not try to make another move upon the Ohio River before winter. Thus, he assigned Captain Philip Aubrey with the task of raiding the post at Loyal Hanning.
Now, in the morning of October 12, 1758, business as usual down in Fort Ligonier. There's probably about 1,500 men down there, mixture of colonial and regular soldiers. They're working to improve the defenses down there. They're not finished yet. The fort is not finished, and that's key to remember. There would have been a sprawling encampment on the valley floor below us, and then surrounding that open area that had been cleared of timber by the British, you have to understand a lot of this would have been wilderness surrounding it. So if the French were up on this hilltop, and for the record, we don't know if they actually were or not, but if they were, and they would have a really good bird's eye view of what their target is, the unfinished post of Loyal Hanning. And it appears that at the very least the French try to use these ridges to screen their movements. They come down into the valley. Now, mind you, when you're down the valley floor, you're not going to be able to be seen from Fort Ligonier because of all the trees. And it's possible that there was fog the morning of October 12th, which would screen French and Indian movements on the valley floor as they crept closer to Fort Ligonier. French have 600 men at arms for this raid. They are still outnumbered by the British. They're not going to be able to overwhelm and envelop the encampment. But what they could do was really rain terror upon those soldiers inside the retrenched encampment, demoralize them and make them not want to continue advancing west and attack Fort Duquesne late in fall of 1758.
It's important to note that on October 12th, Bouquet was not present at Ligonier. He had been called away to meet with Forbes, as the remainder of the British Army were in the process of improving their supply road to the east. Command over the post at Loyal Hanning therefore fell in the hands of James Burd. In his own words, he would report the following. This day at 11 a.m., the enemy fired 12 guns to the southwest of us, upon which I sent out 2 parties to surround them, but instantly the firing increased. Upon which I sent out a large party of 500 men. They were forced to the camp, and immediately a regular attack ensued, which lasted a long time, I think about 2 hours. But we had the pleasure to do that honor to His Majesty's arms to keep his camp at Loyal Hanning. I can't inform you of our loss, nor that of the enemy, must refer you to the practicals of Lieutenant Colonel Lloyd. One of their soldiers, which we have mortally wounded, says they were 1,200 strong and 200 Indians, but I can ascertain nothing of this further. I have drove them off the field, but don't doubt of a second attack. If they do, I'm ready, being most sincerely. Excuse the scrawl being in a little hurry at present, since writing we have been fired upon. Burd would have likely been somewhere inside the center of the retrenched camp during the raid. He would have known what he was sending out, but no way of knowing what was going to happen to those guys on the battlefield. There does exist a French account of Aubrey's raid from Captain Pierre Pouchot. He was stationed in Canada at the time. He was not at the Battle of Fort Ligonier, but did write down information which had been passing up the line of communication. Monsieur Aubrey, a captain of the Illinois, left Fort Duquesne with an attachment of Canadians and Indians, about 600 strong, to reconnoiter the English who were encamped at Royal Hanning. They found a little camp in front of some entrenchment which would cover a body of 2,000 men. The advance guard of our detachment having been discovered, the English sent a captain and 50 men to reconnoiter, who fell in with the detachment and were entirely defeated. In following the fugitives, the French fell upon this little camp and surprised and dispersed it. The fugitives scarcely gained the principal entrenchment which Monsieur Aubry held in blockade 2 days. He killed 200 cattle and horses. Our people returned almost all mounted. They estimated the loss of the enemy at 200 men, while ours was a corporal and 2 soldiers. Neither of these accounts provide a complete picture of the fighting around Fort Ligonier on October 12th. What we are left with are clues.
Now, this map was done in 1760 by a Theodosius MacDonald, and it's pretty interesting. Shows stuff that you're not going to see here today. Notice that there are 2 cannon batteries, one on the west side, one on the east side, and they have a very circular, look to them. A very almost like a flat horseshoe. It's not like a deep horseshoe, but am I making sense describing that? But you know what I'm saying. There's a cannon battery on either side of the inner fort. Note the outer wall. Runs from a bastion, circles around to the north, but it really doesn't cover the whole outer wall. It just covers the west and north side. And then you can see a redoubt out there, which we do get accounts of redoubts being under fire during the battle on October 12th. Maybe that's one of the redoubts that survived for 3 years after the battle. You can see a second redoubt and then a third redoubt. And then again, even though this is 1760, MacDonald made sure to note east of the fort, 2 swords crossing, indicating a battle fought on October 12, 1758, adjacent to a structure labeled the Maryland Hospitals. And we talk about the Maryland suffering some casualties. So that was where their encampment was. Their encampment appears to be near the scene of action on October 12. So at least a portion of the fighting we can all be pretty confident saying was on the east side of Fort Ligonier. All right, you gotta use your imagination. A few blocks over my shoulder is the eastern gates to Fort Ligonier. So I'm standing east of the fort on East Main Street, kind of going on the eastern outskirts of the modern town. And the reason I'm doing all this is to kind of show you how this ground sharply drops off not too far from the eastern gates of Fort Ligonier. Now, I know that there's probably been changes to the landscape because of the establishment of the town, but it's safe to say that there was a natural descent right around here, which meant those French soldiers and native warriors that were coming to assail the fort from the east side, well, they would have had an area where they had some pretty darn good cover from the British muskets and artillery pieces in Fort Ligonier. They would be able to creep pretty decently close, especially if we don't really know how far the tree lines cut back. If some of this is still covered in foliage, they got really good cover as they're making their way, inching their way up the hill to try to creep into the entrenched encampment at the Post of Loyal Hannah from its eastern side.
At Braddock's defeat 3 years earlier, the artillery became early targets of the French and were quickly neutralized. But having time to prepare defenses, the British guns of the Forbes expedition were in better position to make a difference, like in the October 12th raid. Burd would later describe the music the big guns produced, eclipsing the noise of the enemy's fire.
Now, when you visit Fort Ligonier today, you are going to see one of the most impressive collections of mid-18th century field artillery, at least what you can find in the United States of America today. Now, this is all reconstructed, fort's reconstructed, artillery pieces reconstructed, but the artillery is meticulously rebuilt based off original documents. And actually, they're a bit of movie celebrities. If I could go on a tangent for a moment, a couple of the field pieces, your classic cannons, they were used just a few years ago in the production of The Pale Blue Eye for Netflix. Now, granted, that movie is set in the 1830s at West Point Academy. Why French and Indian war guns or West Point Academy? Let's not talk about that. But if you do watch closely, you can actually see some of the cadets in the movie doing firing demos with one of Fort Ligonier's field guns. So, interesting tidbit. Anyways, back to the Battle of Fort Ligonier. A detachment of artillery is sent over the mountains with this advance party under James Byrd's command back in August of 1758. Now, depending on the sources, go back and forth, it's really hard to gauge what artillery was here on October 12, 1758. But we do know there was some type of artillery. It's generally accepted that the main armament beyond the Brown Bess musket that the British have here is the Coehorn mortar. These guys are pretty small. They're the smallest, one of the smallest forms of artillery you'll find here at Fort Ligonier. They fire exploding shells. What it loads very similar to a cannon. You have a ramrod, you'd sponge the piece, all that wonderful stuff. They're firing exploding shells about 4.5 inches in diameter. And when you fire these mortars, you got to physically light the fuse. Usually they would have a pole called a lens stock, has a piece of slow match on the end. You have to light the fuse. Then you got a live bomb ticking away, a literal ticking time bomb in the barrel. Light the charge behind the exploding shell and propel it in an arc up into the air. And the higher trajectory, the shorter the range. Lower trajectory, longer the range. Coehorn mortars don't have a massive range, but those exploding shells, when they detonate, they're going to cause quite a number to anybody trying to attack Fort Ligonier. Even if it goes out into the trees, I mean, if it detonates, hits a tree, you have the shrapnel coming down on the native warriors, the French Marines that are spread out through the wilderness, and then you got all of the tree branches crashing down upon them. So just these little Coehorn mortars would have done quite a number upon the attacking forces October 12, 1758. And it's generally said that the mortars is what holds the attackers back from getting any closer to the retrenched camp here.
With all the clues laid before us, this is my own interpretation of the events of October 12, 1758. At 11 o'clock that morning, a contingent of the British Grass Guards south or west of the fort encountered the rear of Aubrey's raiding party. These would have been the first gunshots Burd later reported. Losing the element of surprise, Aubrey rushed his men toward the east side of the fort to try and cut off their main supply artery, the Forbes Road. As the French and their native allies splashed across the Loyalhanna Creek, they drove back multiple British detachments that Burd was sending out to try and ascertain the situation beyond the retrenched camp. While Aubrey managed to blunt every attack Burd tried, he could not break through the main defenses of the fort. As day turned to night, the French and their native allies made feint attacks in different directions, testing the strength of the British garrison. Every appearance by Aubrey was answered with British artillery fire. Under the cover of darkness, Aubrey plundered what British resources were within his command's grasp before departing for Fort Duquesne. When it was all over, the British casualty list included 12 dead, 18 wounded, and 31 missing. Burd reported the burial of 4 Frenchmen. An official casualty list for the French is not known to exist. Losses amongst the tribes which supported the operation are unknown. For the moment, the British maintained their forward outposts, but as more of Forbes' army arrived, no immediate advance was made. It appeared that La Petite-Guerre would succeed in securing the Ohio country for France for another winter.
So I'm currently standing in the structure that's referred to as Forbes' hut here at Fort Ligonier. Now, in truth, there's no exact knowing where Forbes' headquarters was at Fort Ligonier, but this does a good job of recreating what the atmosphere must have been like in his office, essentially. Now, General Forbes will arrive here November 2nd, 1758, and boy, he was not happy with what was going on out here. His campaign was sputtering to a halt. It was deteriorating right in front of him. He had taken the advice of John Sinclair that there was a good location for foraging and a supply base west of the Allegheny Mountain and Laurel Ridge, and that had gotten him into a lot of trouble. First, the unauthorized attack on Fort Duquesne in September, he did not approve of that. Then he hears about the raid that happens here on October 12th. And really, since that raid, the army has just been working tirelessly to fortify this location. Forbes even heard a rumor that the new engineer, Harry Gordon, he was building the fort to withstand a siege and was infuriated by all the time, energy, and labor that was going into what was supposed to be just a supply depot that could have been used, all those resources could have been used in forwarding the advance on Fort Duquesne. And even his diplomacy with the native tribes, it's deteriorating. He's balancing numerous different tribes that don't really get along with each other. He needs to get the trust of the Delaware who live in the Ohio River Valley. He has to get their support so they will stop raiding the Pennsylvania frontier and will allow the British to move in and kick the French out of this region. And at the same time, he's trying to keep the Cherokee and Catawba warriors in support of this army. They're his eyes and ears. They're essentially scouts. But as the campaign season goes further and further into the winter, more and more of those warriors are heading back home. They were promised a campaign of success, and now they are sitting with nothing to do, and they need to go back home and take care of their families. Long road back to the Smoky Mountains. And another side tangent. Some of the Cherokee warriors, as they passed through Virginia on their way home, would end up getting accosted and murdered by some Virginian settlers who thought they were a war party. And that would spur a whole other conflict. Yeah, we open a whole new theater of conflict now. The Anglo-Cherokee War down in the Carolina backcountry. Yeah, good job, Forbes. Yeah, it's not going well for him. And on November 11th, 1758, there's going to be a council of war hosted here at Fort Ligonier. He's going to call all of his officers together, and he asks them their honest opinion. Do we continue the assault on Fort Duquesne? Do we winter here for the rest of the year? Or do we just quit this campaign and go back east? And after much debate amongst all the various officers here, like Burd, like Bouquet, like Washington, it's ultimately decided they're going to make winter quarters here at Fort Ligonier and wait until spring to renew the offensive. You may also know that this sounds very familiar to a certain early episode of Retracing History, because I was in this room several years ago basically describing the same events. And you know what comes next. On November 12, 1758, just a few hours after Forbes had essentially given up on the campaign, an event is going to occur that's going to put the life of George Washington in as much jeopardy it would ever be in before or since, and really is the true turning point of the Forbes campaign. I'm talking about George Washington's friendly fire incident. So we're inside the Washington Gallery at the Fort Ligonier Museum, and you may recognize this painting if you're a long viewer of the channel. The painting was done just back in 2019 by Chaz Fagan, and as a depiction of what the friendly fire incident near Fort Ligonier may have looked like. We did a whole episode of Retracing History a few years back about this terrifying moment in George Washington's life. And this is pretty much seen as the pivotal battle to happen around Fort Ligonier. Now, if you want to learn more about the friendly fire incident, I do encourage you to watch that episode, but understand that was done before this gallery got a, let's just say, a makeover, because in 2025, an announcement was made about archaeological digs that have been happening at a location near Fort Ligonier, believed to be the site of the friendly fire incident. So some of the information that's said in that episode of Retracing History, based largely on primary source documents and historians making educated guesses and my own personal 2 cents on the matter. Now we have archaeological evidence to back up what was going on November 12, 1758. And the archaeology conflicts a little bit with some primary sources. It's making people guess what went down that evening. So we're just going to quickly kind of walk through this new exhibit. Of course, I encourage you to come in person to really look in detail at the artifacts they have displayed here. Like I mentioned, this is still an ongoing archaeological survey, so not all the pieces are put together, not all the information is finalized yet. So in another 5 years, we may be saying something different, but pretty cool right now to see some archaeological findings from what may be the site of Washington's most dangerous moment in his military career.
As important as the friendly fire incident would become for George Washington, it also changed the course of the Forbes expedition. At some point during the day, Virginia provincials managed to capture 3 French soldiers. Their interrogation provided a grim picture of Captain Lignerie's ability to defend Fort Duquesne. With the success of Grant's defeat, as well as Aubrey's raid upon Fort Ligonier, most of the natives of Militia supporting Lignerie went home for the winter, confident the British would be unable to rally before year's end. Lignerie also was beginning to grow nervous about negotiations between the Ohio River tribes and British representatives, and he was uncertain over when new provisions would actually reach his now much reduced garrison. With a narrow window opening up before winter settled in, Forbes capitalized on the moment. He made a rapid advance across the last 50 miles of wilderness, his lead elements catching view of Fort Duquesne on November 24, 1758. But by then, all that was left was a charred ruin. Just days before, Ligonier and his officers had decided to abandon their position, saving their strength to fight another day. In a surprising turn of events, the objective which had set the world ablaze was finally achieved in comparative silence. Of the three engagements of the Forbes expedition, the largest was Grant's defeat. The most decisive was, strangely enough, Washington's friendly fire incident. Yet the one that is most heavily commemorated is the Battle of Fort Ligonier. Every October, the sounds of musket and cannon roar back to life as large crowds fill the streets and shops on the town which sits upon a battlefield. Beyond Pennsylvania's Laurel Highlands, it's likely this battle's never spoken about. So, is the Battle of Fort Ligonier a decisive action? No, but history is rarely woven by one single thread. The Battle of Fort Ligonier was a link in the chain of events known as the Forbes expedition, that in itself was one of numerous threads bound together known as the French and Indian War, which is but one of several blocks that would come to build the foundation of the American Revolution. It truly is fascinating how history is shaped. Or, it's the battle that built Pittsburgh. So no Fort Ligonier, no Pittsburgh Steelers. You can respond to that as you would like in the comments section below.